The wealth gap in Australia between the wealthiest and the broader population is growing, according to a global report by the Swiss bank UBS. It found that more than 25,000 people across the country became millionaires last year, while middle Australia's wealth is going backwards. Here with a closer look is independent economist Saul Eslake. Very good to see you, Saul. Welcome.
Thank you, Ros. Nice to be here.
So in broad terms then, in Australia, the rich are getting richer while the less well-off are getting poorer.
Well, that's not clear itself from the report. What does seem to be clear is that the gap between the middle and the wealthiest is widening. The report actually shows that median wealth, that is the wealth of the person or household that is in the middle of the distribution rate from top to bottom, is the third highest in the world after only Luxembourg and Belgium. But the average, which is total wealth divided by the number of Australian households, is considerably higher than that. It's the sixth highest in the world. But it's about 616,000 US dollars compared with about 270,000 US dollars for the median. Now, the difference between the two is perhaps illustrated by noting that if Elon Musk moved to Australia, average wealth would go up a lot, but median wealth wouldn't change at all. And so the gap between the two gives you an indication of the extent to which those whose wealth is well above the median, the people in the top 10% or so of the distribution of wealth, have been pulling ahead of the rest. And in that sense, Australia has become a little more unequally wealth distributed in recent years, although we're nowhere near as unequally distributed with regard to wealth as, for example, the United States. And one way of illustrating that is to say that in Australia, according to this report, the ratio of the average to the median, that is, the total wealth divided by the number of people, relative to the wealth of the middle Australian household, is about 2.9 times. That's the same as Norway, which is at 3 times, and we think of Norway as a country where wealth is more evenly distributed than in many others. By contrast, in the United States, average household wealth is more than 10 times median household wealth. So yes, wealth is inequitably, or at least unequally distributed in Australia, but less unequally than in the United States and a lot of other comparable countries.
Okay, so Saul, when we say middle Australia, who are we talking about?
Well, in this survey, what we're talking about is all households ranked from the wealthiest to the poorest, the household that is right in the middle of that. And as I say, the median household wealth, according to this survey, is about 210,000 US dollars. And probably one of the reasons why the gap between middle Australians and the wealthiest Australians has been widening is because house prices have been rising so much, and the proportion of Australians who own their own home has been declining.
So if it's all about housing then, does the difference between the wealthiest and the less well-off align with age, Saul? There's a growing gap between the wealth of different generations, in other words.
Well, yes, there is, although this report doesn't say anything specific about wealth by age. ABS data from the household surveys of income and wealth that used to be done every 2 years, although we haven't got one since 2029-20. The one that was meant to be in 2021-22 was cancelled because of COVID, and the one that should have been conducted in 2023-4 was abandoned because of, according to the ABS data, integrity issues. But on the data we have, which is for 2019-20, the proportion of household wealth owned by households where the reference person, as they call it, is over 65, has increased by more than 12 percentage points since the turn of the century. And that's a much bigger increase than the proportion of the population who are aged over 65. And again, that's largely driven by the fact that people over 65 have maintained their home ownership rates for the past 5 or 6 decades, whereas among younger age groups, the proportion of the population who own their own home, either with or without a mortgage, has gone down quite significantly. And of course, older Australians who have more invested in the share market than the like have also benefited to a greater extent from rising share prices. And there have also been, over the last 25 years, some significant changes in the tax system that mean that income accruing to older Australians has tended to be taxed more lightly, more concessionally, than wages and salaries, which is the main form of income accruing to younger Australians. The recent budget seeks to ameliorate that to some extent, and it may be over the next 5 years we see some reversal of the trend towards concentrating wealth in older Australian households that's been very evident over this century in particular.
But Saul, wealth eventually will be passed down, won't it? As older people die, to put it bluntly, the younger generation will be enriched. That's the way it works.
Well, in practice, of course, these days with life expectancy being in the 80s for both men and women, when the older generation now passes away and leaves their assets to their children, those children will be in their 50s and 60s, typically. They won't be young people who haven't hitherto been able to get into their first home. And other data, based on probate records of Supreme Court, suggests that those who do receive an inheritance are likely to be richer, better off in many ways than those who either don't receive one or only receive very small ones. So inheritance is actually likely to exacerbate inequality in the distribution of wealth. And that's particularly the case in Australia because we're one of only 12 out of the 38 OECD economies which doesn't have any form of inheritance tax. You know, Australia abolished its inheritance taxes that we had federally and in the States in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and some other countries, Canada and New Zealand, did that. But interestingly, both the United States and the United Kingdom, whose tax systems are commonly used as a reference point of comparison for ours, and we certainly saw that during the debate about the budget measures when people who were campaigning against the proposed changes to capital gains tax made the point that in the US and the UK, capital gains would be taxed more lightly now than in Australia. But the US and the UK still have death duties, and in the UK in particular, they're quite strict death duties. And interestingly, neither St. Ronald Reagan nor St. Margaret Thatcher saw fit to abolish the inheritance taxes that those countries have, whilst they were doing some significant and far-reaching tax reforms in both countries in the 1980s. So Australia's a bit of an outlier in this respect, and maybe if we're to see further comprehensive tax reform, some consideration of an inheritance tax ought to be on the table. That's a very unpopular and not very widely shared opinion, I acknowledge, but it might be something that we should be thinking about.
Saul Eslake, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.